Hi, in today's lecture, we'll survey a brief overview of the basics of human cognitive architecture and the processes involved in how we learn. Please take notes and jot down questions as you view the lecture, and follow up with Dr. Cranbiel with any questions that you have. Before we dive into learning, we have to talk about perception. This is because perception determines how we see the world. Perception involves our senses and how our memory relates with them to interact with the world. In terms of what we're interested in for learning, our primary focus will be on vision and hearing, since those are the senses that have the most impact on learning. Much of what we sense, or sensation, happens without our conscious effort. You look out your front window and you do not have to think about much to sense driveways, the road, cars driving by. You do not need to think to yourself, okay, what do I see? You just see it. This is sensation. Sensation is objective in that your senses are real actions caused by signals between your body. However, sensation leads us to perception, which is where our efforts to interpret the signals begin. And our perception is not completely objective. It is our attempt to interpret what we are sensing. So perception varies based on its context at the individual and contextual levels. Additionally, we can think of two ways in which perception is processed. Bottom-up processing is in a simplified way how we interact with things we do not have prior knowledge of. So newborns, for instance, are very frequently engaged in bottom-up processing. It begins and ends with the sense that triggered the perception of it. Top-down processing, however, occurs when we apply our prior knowledge stored in long-term memory to help us understand what we do perceive. For what it's worth, we haven't talked about short-term, long-term memory, but think of it as things you've memorized. So top-down processing, we allow what we know in our memory to interpret what we perceive. The distinctions here have some helpful implications for us to consider as it relates to teaching and learning. First, prior knowledge is perhaps the single most important factor in determining how learners will perceive new information. This means they will ask different questions of new material based primarily on which background information they are using to help interpret the new material. Second, every single learner comes to a learning situation with different prior knowledge. As a result, they will perceive things differently as the specific information they bring to bear from their prior knowledge influences how they make meaning with the new material. This makes it important for teachers to consider what is essential for everyone to know. This shared knowledge helps ensure everyone has the basic knowledge that's needed to engage in collective processing. E.D. Hirsch has developed a framework for this, which he calls cultural literacy, and I think it's a smart approach for states and districts and schools to follow, to think of and draw upon to help build the broadest and most equitable curricula that they can. Third, how we perceive the world relies on our prior knowledge, and that means that there is an important role to play for memorization, including rote memorization, as well as developing understanding. So, of course, our long-term aim for learning is not going to be aimed at these lower things, and yet it's marked towards understanding. That's our aim. But knowledge of any kind is helpful to make our perceptions more accurate. So there's another interesting aspect to know with regards to our perception. As our knowledge base grows, much of how we perceive the world, that is, how our prior knowledge informs our sensation, becomes largely automatized. As this happens, it becomes difficult to see how we are processing things ourselves. Researchers call this the curse of knowledge. Building knowledge is crucial to making increasingly accurate perceptions. However, the more knowledge we have, the more it becomes organized into integrated formations, leading us to not even know how our own knowledge is influencing everything. Here's a cartoon that displays the curse of knowledge in action. The key to know here is that what you know determines what you see and not the other way around. Building knowledge is a crucial aspect for the instruction so that our learners are better equipped to process the world around them. Next, let's move to attention. Once our mind senses something and we perceive it, it means that we must give attention to it. But our attention is a limited capacity resource. That makes it distinct from sensation, which does not really get overloaded. Now, some might think this is a tragedy since it's our point of attention which determines what we think about and therefore we can learn, but this is actually really a blessing. If at any given moment your attention was constantly divided up among all the various sensations you were exposed to, we would live in madness. Anyway, there's much more we could say with regards to attention, including a somewhat varied understanding of exactly what it is. But it will be more helpful for us to focus in on attention as it relates to cognitive science. And so we are going to think of attention as our working memory. In other words, what are we thinking about right now? Hopefully right now you're thinking about attention and you're paying attention to my lecture rather than your email. But nonetheless, here, attention, working memory, sometimes called short-term memory, and it's one of the single most important theories for learning as that derives from this is called cognitive load theory. And I'd like to take a minute to look at that right now. So cognitive load theory was developed by John Sweller, and a great summary of it, along with its application in instructional design, is provided by Chandler and Sweller. You can read it right here. But there are three, basically a great summary is this. Since we can only process a limited amount of information at any given time, it's very important to avoid overloading attention with unnecessary material. There are three types of cognitive load as understood by the theory. Intrinsic load refers to the amount of effort to process the topic imposed by the task or topic. So just it's intrinsic to that thing that you're learning about. Extraneous load refers to the amount of effort to process the topic imposed by features related to how the information is presented. So you're watching this through a PowerPoint presentation in a video format. These are extraneous. It could have just been a text that you read. Germane load refers to the amount of effort required to process the information itself, making connections between it and other information, and constructing understanding. Germane load is really where we want to kind of see the priority of our efforts done, because that's what the students are focusing on. So what does all this mean? First, the theory suggests that when designing learning experiences, it is wise to recognize the intrinsic load of the topic or task being learned. If it's a particularly difficult one, that we need to manage accordingly. Likewise, if it's a simple concept, germane load is the type of tasks that germane load is the type of tasks and activities that students do with the topic or concept itself, taking notes, creating a picture, filling out a table or a web, and so forth. Extraneous load, however, ought to be minimized. A few common examples that add extraneous load include asking students to work in loud environments or adding in all sorts of technology into a lesson. Extra stimuli just distract us. So unless a key objective is to develop skill to work in a loud environment, it's advised that you build a classroom that does not have one. Unless a key objective is to learn a specific technology tool, then adding one in just reduces the amount of attention that's given to the topic you want the students to learn. So it's just a few examples of how we want to minimize extraneous load so that we can maximize the effectiveness of learning. Second, evidence from the past 4 decades points us to the fact that no one actually multitasks. When we engage in what we call multitasking, what we were really doing is switching between tasks. And research has consistently found that this results in our giving less attention to all areas we multitask in, resulting in less effective learning. Third, since our working memory is limited and does not hold information for a long period of time, it is important to acknowledge the issue of mind wandering. People get distracted quite easily, and their minds wander off topic at hand to other areas. The single most important thing for us teachers to know about this is that tasks that are too easy or too difficult make mind wandering more likely. In closing, I would argue that cognitive load theory is the single most important thing that every educator should know about learning. So we've established the fact that we need to manage the load we are asking the learners to grapple with at any given time, but that begs the question, how limited is our memory? George Miller, back in the 1950s, published a paper that set the standard with a funny name. The title was The Magical Number 7 ± 2. He found through empirical investigation that people could hold 7 distinct, not previously known items in their minds at any given time, ± a few. Neil Cowan, however, rounded that down to 4 ± 1 in the early 2000s. Knowing the specific number really is not all that crucial. What is more important is knowing that the information we have stored in long-term memory, that is, information and processes that we have memorized, do not take up any of this precious limited space. Memory then becomes crucial to maximizing our learning effectiveness. So we'll close out our lecture on cognitive processes with a look at memory. Everything that we do relies on our memory. You cannot interact with the world without your prior knowledge influencing how you interact with it. What you know determines what you see. However, memory is not like a library where a book is published, put on the shelf, and is completely the same years from now. Memory is reconstructive. Memory fades over time if we do not reuse it. One thing that we'll explore quite a bit in the program is the ways in which we can enhance our ability to help our memory endure. Simply understood, we have several parts of our cognitive system that will the bottom line is that they can change. And so as we think about the concepts in our working memory, we begin to create stores in our long-term memory which can be developed increasingly strongly over time. For teachers, we need to be carefully consider the working memory challenges we place on students, and we ought to prioritize getting our students to increase their stored knowledge in long-term memory. So let's close out here with a slide. This is my own model of the mind as it relates to learning. So it is a visual depiction of what is going on between all these pieces we've looked at. So look at the visual, pause the video, glance through the notes provided, and reflect back on today's video to close out. Our knowledge of the mind is a central factor in terms of our improving our effectiveness at cultivating lessons, experiences, and environments that promote learning. Here are a few here are the APA references noted in today's slideshow. Write up a one paragraph summary of this lecture, and after you put away your notes, as an immediate attempt to retrieve some of the information you just interacted with. Then look back at the questions you recorded and see if you can answer any of them now. If not, reach out to me with questions.